Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing a new law allowing illegal foreign nationals the ability to work in state-licensed careers. Washington's newest incentive to keep its state patrol ranks filled. An update to a hotel for the homeless that needed hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of construction to get the meth out. And the latest law allowing strip clubs to offer a drink with your lap dance. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now, let's jump into the headlines. Federal law requires employers to ask for proof of eligibility to work, but protects immigrants from discrimination in hiring. A new law in Washington state is changing what careers a person who may be in this country illegally can work in. Investigative reporter TJ Martinell covered this bill signing. What changes when this new law goes into effect, TJ?
Well, what's going to happen is that people who are possibly not legally allowed to be in the country can apply for commercial licenses and certificates that they need to be certified for a variety of different careers. And that includes nurses, teachers, architects, pharmacists, dentists, and dental hygienists, home care providers, even sex offender treatment providers. So, and that's just there's at least 2 pages of different professions that require either a license or certification.
So it's an occupational licensing issue, but there's also a driving aspect to it, right? Where then you get into like the commercial driver's licenses, and that's a little bit different, correct?
Yeah. And one of the things that it doesn't do is it doesn't apply to anything where there's an interstate compact. So stuff where they have to be cooperating with other states, it wouldn't apply.
Like if you're driving from Washington in a big rig going over to Oregon through California down to Arizona. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And it's because then that person wouldn't be considered, if they're not going to be considered licensed or their permit certification isn't considered valid in that state, then that's going to be a problem.
Well, it does make sense too, because long over the road truck drivers have to have a license. You'll see those little stickers on the sides of semis that show that they're licensed to drive in those respective states. So that does make a little bit of sense. So the bill, though, did pass with bipartisan support, but some did object to this, correct?
Yeah, there was some people who were opposed to it. And one of the people to speak on it was Representative Eric Robertson, who said one of the issues is that this allows them to get certified. It allows them to get a license. It does not pertain to an employer who could then say, I can't hire you or I won't hire you because you're not legally supposed to be in the country. And they can't force them to hire someone or make it illegal for them to hire somebody who's here illegally.
Because of the federal requirement. But then again, you can't discriminate against them, but you can ask for verification. And I wonder, and I think you mentioned this when we were discussing this bill earlier, is this technically the verification that you would be able to provide as an illegal immigrant to say, I am, here, this is my verification. This new law would provide them that license to say that, and they would not have to provide the fact that they don't have their citizenship.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting how they implement this bill and how it goes, really is kind of tiptoeing around a issue where somebody is legally not supposed to be in the country, but people are different government entities are choosing not to enforce that law.
I mean, at this point, the the federal government is run by somebody who would be more sympathetic to workers in the country illegally. But say, this November, we find ourselves with a new president that has famously promised to protect American workers and the like. But to be able to say, okay, Washington, you're now in the crosshairs where this allowance that you're going to give these people in the country illegally licenses to work is no longer going to work. And they would crack down on this. I can't imagine being an employer that's already got these people hired, knowing that you could have the Department of Justice calling.
Right. It's going, like I said, it's going to lead to it could potentially lead to litigation in some form. And the question is, who's going to be suing who at that point? Because let's say that this just occurred to me. Let's say that you're somebody who's applying for a job at an employer, and you find out that the person who got hired is not actually allowed to be in the country. Would you have grounds for a lawsuit that they're giving a job to somebody who's not supposed to be legally allowed to be in the country? What kind
liabilities, right?
Yeah, it would create liabilities. And then also, let's say that this person who got hired was using a false social security number or a fraudulent one or stolen one. The state agencies are not allowed to disclose that for any reasons except tax or licensing purposes. And so what happens when somebody's social security number is being used fraudulently so that this person can work?
Well, that might fall under a completely different jurisdiction altogether, but I can't imagine it not happening. If it comes down to somebody trying to feed their family, they're willing to bend the law. They came here under, outside of the law in the first place. It does sound plausible. And on another thought too, you mentioned this, is the thought of people in the country illegally taking some of this is specialized work where, the OECD might say there are only 20,000 of these technically employed, HVAC specialists that are in the country altogether. I wonder if this could upset some citizens here legally for trying to break into these industries.
I think the other thing that has to be taken into account is the fact that this may never be said explicitly. It may never be said even implicitly. But what you have when you have somebody who's not supposed to be in the country legally, who's under your employment, that creates a sort of Damocles where if they can offer less money, the employer can maybe violate some laws with this understanding that you won't complain or else I'm going to turn you over to the federal government. This is, again, this is one of the issues where having people who are not supposed to be here illegally work is that they can use their status, their lack of valid presence in the country as a way of violating the law themselves, because that person's not going to go to the government because then they're going to get ratted out as well.
And the Biden administration has, through Julie Su, the labor secretary, acting labor secretary, they've tried to crack down on that, if I remember correctly, right, with migrant labor in the agriculture industry. That became a priority of theirs last year. On the other hand, to play devil's advocate, why should we stop someone that's come here and applying a trade that they may already know how to do? Say I was a plumber in Venezuela and I want to come here and contribute to the economy that's not currently suffering hyperinflation and rampant crime. That argument, I can see. I think it's fairly compelling because you look at the difference between somebody coming here and becoming an upright citizen eventually, if possible, and then being able to take and become a contributor to the tax base as compared to being somebody who takes away from the tax base because they don't have a means of supporting themselves. So that's, I guess, the neoliberal thought process behind all of this. But thank you, TJ. This is a fascinating story, and we'll see how it plays out once this does take effect. Moving on, Washington is facing a major shortage of law enforcement. That's no secret. The COVID-19 pandemic indeed did make it worse. A new law the governor signed this week isn't looking to bring in new workers, but to keep the veteran officers on for a bit longer. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson joins us. Carlene, how does this bill achieve that objective?
Well, they're basically going to, offer a 5-year a pretty significant size carrot to these guys that have been there. If you've been a Washington state trooper for 26 years or more, we want you to stay on for the next year, 2, 3, 4, even though you're retirement eligible, stay on, and we will offer you $15,000 a year each of those years you stay on beyond retirement eligibility, to keep up the numbers of state patrol, because right now at any given day in the state of Washington, there are more than 170 vacancies in the field. That's every single day. That's about 25% of who would be, working on any given day statewide. So 1 out of 4 officers who would be, working our state highways, responding to these horrible crashes that we keep having, pulling over DUI drivers. They're not out there. We just do not have them. So this is a way of keeping these folks that are otherwise eligible to retire in the pipeline.
Now, for those unfamiliar with what happened, I mean, there was a police shortage before the COVID-19 pandemic, but can you explain the background of how the pandemic and, laws adjacent in that same timeline resulted in a major loss of officers in Washington state?
Oh, just huge. We lost thousands of government employees across the state. Most of that due to the vaccine mandate during COVID. When all was said and done, I think it was October of 21 is when we got the final numbers from the office of Governor Jay Inslee saying how many state troopers separated from employment due to the mandate. That number was 127. Now that doesn't account for folks who retired early. Hundreds more did that because they said, forget it. I'm not getting the jab and I'm out of here. So
it's not worth it. Right.
Exactly. Many people were concerned about impacts, of the vaccine. And so you had 127 that separated from employment due to the mandate. 53 of those were civil servants and 74 though were commissioned officers. 67 of those troopers, 6 were sergeants and 1 captain. So we lost that many folks with, experience out there. And despite all the efforts that have been made in the last 3 years, opening up the academy option to, folks that want to be a trooper that might not otherwise qualify, that kind of lowered some of those criteria, all that. So they're coming in, but that's a slow curve too. Right. And then you've got these new officers who really need a mentor, and they do. They get, paired up with a veteran officer for their first several years on the force. So keeping those officers that have all of that experience on, the hope is it's going to really benefit Washington State Patrol overall. Right.
Now, so with most police officer positions, senior officers that I've known, throughout my career that I've spoken with, law enforcement officers always have an eye on the total pay being as high as possible in their final years so that when their pension clicks and catches, it's based on an average that is a heightened salary, or be it artificially. This means that their retirement years are compensated at a rate that's higher than if they simply locked it in at their final rate of pay. When I heard about this story initially, when you had pitched this, I first wondered whether Washington taxpayers wouldn't just be paying the cost of the bonuses, but the additional legacy cost of the artificially inflated pensions via these bonuses for officers that take these payouts. Now, was this considered in this bill's legislative process, Carlene?
It absolutely was. And, very early on in the initial public hearings for this bill, it was made clear because obviously some folks that control budgets in the state were thinking the same thing you were, Cole. So I asked Washington State Patrol Captain Dion Glover about that. I was like, okay, this sounds all great, but we, the taxpayer, then going to be on the hook for a much bigger pension forever out based on, these guys making $15,000 more a year because they stayed on. And he said the bonuses will not represent any long-term burden. They're not going to be part of the pension. They're not pension eligible in any way. Doesn't go toward average final salary for the 5 years that they've worked. Now, that said, as you mentioned, many of these veteran officers that have maybe been retirement eligible or close to it in recent years, with the numbers of officers so depleted, I've talked to many of them that are like, yeah, I was going to retire in 2022, but heck, they need me for so much overtime, and I'm already a senior officer making a decent living.
Right.
So they've stayed on. So certainly that would have made sense to question that. And I'm glad, I guess, from the taxpayer perspective, that these additional longevity bonuses aren't going to be part of, what makes them pension eligible.
Yeah, a rare moment of foresight from legislators during the process, but credit to them. Thank you, Carlene. Moving on, Washington is one of the few states in America that does not allow alcohol in adult entertainment venues. That is soon to change. TJ covered this one. What kind of adult venues are we talking about in question here, TJ?
We're talking about strip clubs.
Okay, just wanted to make that clear. Thank you. The thought behind the alcohol ban in many of these areas is that mixing the two, strip clubs and alcohol, is known to invite trouble. Was there any talk of that in the legislative process behind allowing this?
Yeah, because the bill doesn't just allow liquor to be served at these places. There's a lot of workplace training, safety training. There's panic buttons in certain rooms where the workers, or strippers, if you will, are alone with a customer. And so there's also just more regulations around workplace safety.
Now, the new law will do more than just put booze behind the bars and train up some people in Washington strip clubs, correct?
Yeah, it's going to do some other stuff as well. Though there was a bit of controversy over the fact that they are removing the entire Washington Administrative Code regarding liquor licenses. And so for background, it's regarding lewd conduct. And there was actually a bit of a controversy earlier this year when Seattle police and members of the Liquor and Cannabis Control Board visited these Seattle bars and, were under the suspicion that they were engaging in lewd conduct, where there was nudity of some kind at a place where liquor was being served.
We did hear some interesting stories about how lawmakers celebrated the passage of this law, didn't we?
Yeah, apparently they went to a strip club.
We did not cover this specifically to dive in, but in terms of some of the reporters that were covering the topic, apparently that was the appropriate way to celebrate the passage of this bill through the legislature. Now, what's funny, TJ, is looking up laws in other states in terms of just to say, what other states allow what. There is some wild statutes across the country that some seem to make absolutely no sense. I found one in Harris County. This is reported on an outlet called Complex. Harris County, Texas, requires that everyone working in these adult venues wear at all times a Class 2 sexually oriented business permit on their person as an adult performer. I'm not quite sure how logistically that works, but one of those odd things. And back in Washington, another odd law regarding strip clubs that I believe is still on the books is that a dancer cannot be fully nude unless she's at least 6 feet away from any patrons. Maybe that's a holdover from COVID. I don't know. I didn't really dive too much into the context of that rule. I did not want to have a phone call with HR regarding my sordid search history after that research. Thank you, TJ. We'll hopefully not have to report on that one again. Washington State, King County specifically, has spent millions of dollars trying to get homeless people off of the streets and into housing. One of these methods has been to buy old hotels and turn them into shelters. It's a costly endeavor that's also proven time-consuming. In Federal Way, a hotel purchased using taxpayer dollars is been sitting in limbo. Residents got an update on this project this week. Our very own Federal Way resident, Carlene, reported on this. Where are we on this project, Carlene?
Oh, let's see. Not very far along when it comes to one of the main projects. The folks who live in South King County, or specifically even Federal Way, may be familiar with the former Red Lion Hotel on 348. That's a main intersection crossing the old Pacific Highway South and near the Costco shopping complex and all that, for some context for folks. It has been more than 3 years since King County purchased that old hotel, launching what they called the Health Through Housing Initiative to address the homeless crisis / drug crisis. And the program received $9 million initially from the state to fund rehab for the hotel. Basically, get it up to speed. Still going to have the individual hotel rooms you can picture for folks who are unhoused and in crisis, many of them needing all kinds of wraparound services. They'll still have their hotels, but part of the building to be renovated for staff that would live there 24/7 to, be responsible for security and to, offer, making sure that person who's in crisis in the middle of the night has what they need. Kind of just trying to get people off the street life and back into functioning members of society. But for nearly 2 years, what folks didn't know until it was uncovered by the media late last year is that King County was hiding the fact that nothing had been done with the hotel. Zero, nada, except for inspectors going in and going, wow, this is a meth-infested hole that we can't even put people into to begin to clean up because it's that dangerous. And the fight has been going on since then over how to remedy it, how much to put toward abatement. Should we just tear the thing down? But it sounds like finally, based on the meetings this last week, there's a bit of progress.
No, yeah. And there are state laws, to my understanding, of acceptable levels of meth, which sounds like the most wild thing I've ever heard. But in terms of you have to treat it like just any type of hazardous material, in that you have an acceptable parts per million. And it was apparently well beyond that. So they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this remediation is what it's called to get rid of it. But it sounds like the person that had to do the remediation had to gut the place. And now there's a lawsuit involved with this?
Yes, there are actually multiple lawsuits, and there are people still trying to keep this thing from even opening. Because you can imagine the liability, like you say, the acceptable levels of methamphetamine contamination. I mean, would you want to buy a home if then, you found out, not that these people are buying the homes, obviously taxpayers are going to be paying for them to have their housing and other services. But if you found out years later that it was a meth-infested hole, obviously there is so much potential liability there. So there are folks just on the insurance side for the city saying, wait a minute, do we even want to do this? Can we be certain that the remediation, the abatement, whatever they have to do, is going to be enough to protect people? I mean, I can tell you as somebody, I purchased a home in Federal Way about 8 years ago now, Cole. Okay, these people were smokers, serious smokers. It's just nicotine smoke. I went through 3-4 layers of scraping the walls in my home, right? And going through having different contractors come in and go, okay, you do this, and then we do the treatment, we do the sealant, you'll be good to go. I'm telling you, within 2 years, that nicotine is bleeding through the walls.
The smell came back, didn't it? Yeah.
Not only the smell, but the physical images of the nicotine stains, literally like as if they were coming from the roof line of the home down to the inside. So, and that's just nicotine. So,
oh my gosh.
Anyway, there's so many things to consider going forward. But the bigger issue for taxpayers is the fact that King County hid so much for so long that now they're not even trusting that the abatement is going to be enough.
And then the question then becomes, have you passed that point of no return where it would have been up until this point much more cost effective for taxpayers to have just leveled the thing and started from a cement pad and then built something up? Big thank you to all of our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.